Hi, this presentation is about the properties and changes of matter and some different classifications as well as some of the characteristics of metals and nonmetals. So properties and changes in matter can be described based on their properties. You can have extensive properties of matter and you can have intensive properties of matter. So extensive properties depends on the amount of matter that is present. So if I ask you to go and weigh out a rock, and it would be an extensive property because depending on how big the rock is or how little the rock is how much mass it would have. So volume, mass, the amount of energy in a substance, they're all extensive properties. If I were asking you to look at some of the intensive properties, these are properties that do not depend on the amount of matter present. So if I asked you to find the density of that rock, you would go and you would find that it doesn't matter. The density is going to be the same whether I give you a little rock or a big rock, and it's because it's calculated. Melting point, boiling point, being able to conduct electricity, and ability to transfer energy as heat are all intensive properties. If I give you a piece of copper wire, it'll conduct electricity just as much as a whole plate of copper wire would. So now let's look at some of the areas of the periodic table. The periodic table is a huge help for students in chemistry. It holds all kinds of knowledge. Right now you can see this periodic table graphic has it broken down by color. You have this reddish pink over here, which these are all metals. Then you have the green zone here on the right, and these are all nonmetals. This purple group down the side is noble gases, and here in a small band in between the metals and nonmetals are things called metalloids. And metalloids are, sometimes they act as metals, sometimes they act as nonmetals. It depends on the conditions that the element is exposed to. So, some things about the periodic table. The periodic table is lumped up always into those lines and those rows, and so the reason that they're lumped up together is dependent on their properties. So the vertical columns, the up and down, are called groups or families, and each group contains elements with similar chemical properties. So if we go back and look at that graphic, all of the elements in this first column have a similar property that they all adhere to, the same as this element or this column over here on this on the left. I'm sorry, on the right. The purple all have similar properties. If we now talk about the horizontal rows, the rows that go back and forth from left to right, they are called periods. And they also have similar physical and chemical properties, but they may change regularly across that period. So there are, as I said, metals, nonmetals, and metalloids. And metals are any element that is a good electrical conductor and has a good heat conductor. Properties of some metals are, most of them are solids at room temperature. Metals are malleable, meaning they can be hammered or rolled into thin sheets. They're ductile, they can be drawn into a fine wire, and they conduct heat and electricity. These are some examples of metals. You have gold, you have copper, and you have aluminum. They're all three metals. Now the colors will change depending on the element that you're looking at, but for the most part, most metals are shiny when they're not oxidized. Nonmetals are elements that are poor conductors of heat and electricity, and properties of some nonmetals are many of them are gases at room temperature, but when they are a solid, they're brittle, and they are poor conductors of the heat and electricity. Some examples of some nonmetals here are you have the carbon, sulfur, phosphorus, and iodine in their solid forms. Metalloids are, as I said, sometimes they are characteristic of both metal and sometimes they're characteristic of nonmetals. It depends on the conditions that those elements are exposed to. Metalloids are solids at room temperature, and sometimes they can conduct electricity. They won't conduct it as well as a metal, but they conduct it much better than a nonmetal. And the noble gases are all in that far right column, group 18 on the periodic table, and these are unreactive. They're all gases at room temperature. They can be forced to react under extreme conditions, but for the most part, they are thought to be unreactive. So that is some of the information about the broad characteristics of metals, nonmetals, metalloids, and as well as two different classifications of properties as intensive or extensive.